does it mean to raise a temple? Not to men, but to harmony itself. And how does a stone, shaped by humble hands, come to echo through centuries? In silence, welcome to Sleepy Chronicles, where history rests in whispers. Long before the Acropolis stood crowned with white columns and sacred geometry, there was only wind across the hill and the faint rustle of olive leaves in the dusk. The hill itself was modest, not the tallest in the region, not the grandest, but it held a kind of stillness. Birds would circle lazily overhead, coasting on thermals, and shepherds would lead goats among low grass and rough rock, unaware that one day this place would become a symbol not of conquest, but of balance. In the distance, faint clouds gathered above Mount Pentelicus, where marble lay waiting, still and pale, as if asleep beneath the earth. No mortar would ever hold these stones together, only friction, precision, and the quiet agreement between surface and shape. At the heart of it all, there was an idea clear as the Aegean morning, and just as soft, a place to honor Athena, the spirit of wisdom and reason, not with gold alone or triumph, but with proportion, with patience, with a structure that would seem almost to float, though it weighed more than memory. The city of Athens had weathered many seasons by the time construction began. War had come and gone, sometimes with fire, sometimes with treaties, but by the mid-5th century BCE, under the guidance of Pericles, a decision had been made not just to build, but to build with intention, to craft a monument not to fleeting power, but to enduring ideals. And for this, they turned not to architects, but to philosophers of space, mathematicians of light and air. Stone was chosen before drawing. They knew the character of Pentelic marble, its quiet sheen under the sun, its almost golden hue at twilight. Could be quarried, yes, but not hurried. Each block, over time, had to be coaxed from the mountain, not torn. Men would rise early in the cool dawn and walk the winding paths to the mountain's face. There, they would mark the marble with care and begin the slow, rhythmic work of cutting. There was no rushing this process. Bronze tools struck with gentle persistence. Hammers tapped with the patience of rainfall. Wedges were slipped into natural veins, not to shatter, but to persuade. When the stone finally yielded, there was no cheer, only the rustle of linen tunics and a slow shifting of dust. And then the transport. Oxen waited at the foot of the slope, their breath fogging faintly in the morning light. Sledges, greased with olive oil and water, were dragged along wooden tracks. Logs rolled beneath the weight. Men sang low to mark the rhythm, not to celebrate, but to endure. The journey from Pentelicus to the Acropolis took days, sometimes longer. Every corner turned required thought, every incline a strategy, and always the stone was guarded not as a treasure, but as a promise. When finally the marble reached the site, it was not stacked, but studied, Workers moved slowly through the landscape of half-chiseled blocks, walking among them like readers through a library of unwritten pages. Each stone bore a future where it might fit, what it might support. And here, amid the open sky and breeze, geometry was not drawn in chalk, but held in the mind, and in the feel of fingers running along edge and angle. Iktinos and Kallikrates, the architects entrusted with the design, did not seek symmetry alone, but something more elusive: optical harmony. They knew the human eye, when left to its own, sees not in straight lines, but in gentle curves. A truly level line appears to sag, and so the stylobate, the Parthenon's base, was made to rise slightly in the center. Columns were not spaced equally, but carefully varied, so that none seemed thinner or heavier than another. Even the columns themselves bowed inward, just enough to fool the gaze into seeing what it hoped to see: balance. These choices were not ornamental. They were quiet understandings between builders and the viewer, a shared softness. No mortar could have held these stones firmer than that. Elsewhere on the Acropolis, older ruins whispered beneath new scaffolding. The ruins of the earlier Athena temple, burned during the Persian sack, were not erased. Their memory remained in the soil, in fragments of sculpture and darkened foundation. Builders walked among them, not with triumph, but with acknowledgement. Stones remember. Even those cut clean from the mountain carry veins, like stories not yet told. As the days lengthened and shadows grew longer over the city, the base of the Parthenon began to take shape. It was not raised in haste. Each stone was carved to fit, exactly measured against its neighbors, against gravity and against light. The smallest miscalculation would be visible, not immediately, but later, when the sun crossed the temple just so, and cast a line where none should be. And so, the masons worked as though crafting music in stone, measuring not only width and height, but the pause, the breath, the hush between columns. Evenings came gently. The sounds of tools faded with the day, replaced by quiet conversation, by sandals brushing against stone, by the occasional sigh of wind through scaffolding. Workers rested beneath the unfinished frame, sharing bread, water, and stories about the weight of things, of tools, of stone, of memory. Some looked at the rising base and imagined the finished temple. Others simply watched the stars. There was no single moment when the Parthenon became real. It grew layer by layer, as the city did, slowly, thoughtfully, in stone and silence. And under the olive branches, the hill breathed gently, bearing the weight not just of marble, but of meaning. Before marble could reflect the sun from the Parthenon steps, it waited for centuries within the cool silence of Mount Pentelicus. Inside the heart of the mountain, there were no shouts, no echoes of conquest, only the hushed scrape of bronze tools and the occasional flutter of birds startled by footsteps. The quarry was not carved in haste. It was a place of decisions whispered into stone, a landscape of quiet intentions, where each block of marble was chosen not just for its size, but for its potential to rest in harmony with all others. In the early hours, just after the first breeze stirred through the trees, and before the sunlight touched the ridgeline, quarrymen would arrive, their movements slow, steady, as if not to disturb the mountain's long-held dreams. They carried chisels with smoothed handles and rope worn soft by years of calloused hands. Their tunics, pale with dust, bore the memory of countless mornings like this one. The marble they sought was not everywhere. They listened for it, felt it, tapped gently against surfaces to hear the tone beneath. A hollow ring meant a flaw, a subtle crack that would betray the block mid-transport, but a clean note, a soft, dense sound meant the stone was ready. Quietly, patiently, it could be coaxed free. Rather than slicing directly, the quarrymen used a method known for its restraint. They began by carving shallow grooves, measured lines that outlined each block like a frame. Then, with thin bronze wedges inserted into those lines, they poured water. Slowly, as the wedges expanded, the mountain whispered back, sometimes a faint creak, sometimes only a shift in the dust. And with time hours, perhaps a section of marble would loosen, yielding not to force, but to suggestion. The freed blocks were immense, though they did not appear so at first glance. Their mass revealed itself only in the silence they carried, the way the earth trembled gently when they were moved. Workers surrounded the blocks with care, wrapping them in thick cords, brushing away stone dust from edges with folded cloth. These were not just materials. They were commitments. To move one meant to place it someday with precision. To forget where it belonged was to forget the harmony of the whole. Transport began at dawn and could continue past twilight. Teams of oxen waited patiently at the base of the quarry's slope, their harnesses padded with wool, their hooves muffled by dust. Wooden sledges built with layered beams and slicked with animal fat waited to bear the weight. Logs rolled beneath them, replaced again and again with the rhythm of an ancient, wordless choreography. Some workers walked ahead, brushing the path clear of stones. Others followed, adjusting ropes, murmuring to each other in low tones. There were no sharp orders, no sudden movements, just the soft percussion of work. The journey from Pentelicus to the Acropolis was a slow descent through olive groves, past small shrines nestled beside the road, and alongside fields where grain bowed in the breeze. The marble traveled not as a prize, but as a pilgrim, moving with deliberate grace. When it reached the city's edge, it was met by more hand sculptors, architects, apprentices, all of whom had studied the arriving blocks as though greeting an old acquaintance. But before the marble could be hoisted, before it could become part of a drum or a capital, it was laid out and examined under the sky. At the foot of the Acropolis, a flat clearing held dozens, perhaps hundreds of marble pieces, some still raw from the mountain, others already marked with fine red lines, drawn using strings dipped in pigment. These lines indicated future flutes, curves, joints, sometimes faint symbols to guide alignment. There were no blueprints. There were no printed plans. All knowledge passed hand to hand, word to word. Scribes and planners used wax tablets to track placements. Numbers were scratched gently into the edges of stones, not as declarations, but as reminders, an invisible thread to weave one stone to the next. This numbering system, though simple, was poetic. Each stone had a place, and each place made the temple more itself. Carvers worked beside these stones with an almost meditative pace. They wore simple clothes, carried small hammers, and would pause often, resting fingertips along curves, stepping back to see how a groove caught light. They spoke little, if at all, only the rhythmic tap-tap of metal against marble broke the quiet. It sounded like soft rainfall against bone. Fluting the columns was a task of delicacy. The grooves could not be deep nor shallow. They had to flow gently, like ripples frozen in time. Every segment was shaped by hand, guided by tools held at the same angle again and again. There was no haste. The marble would not permit it. And then there was the matter of matching. Since the columns were assembled from separate drums stacked atop one another, the joints had to be seamless. Too tight, and the blocks might crack. Too loose, and the column would drift. And so each face was polished to meet the next smoothed, until even a strand of hair could not fit between them. And without mortar, the weight held them firm, but it was not weight alone. Dowels of bronze and wood were inserted into shallow sockets, anchoring each drum to its neighbor. These were not visible. They were not meant to be. Like trust, they worked in silence. Farther up the slope, scaffolding took shape, not of steel, but of wood and rope. Builders climbed carefully, sometimes barefoot, balancing among beams tied with clever knots and counterweights. They worked with pulleys powered by men walking in circles, treading in grooves etched by countless turns. With these systems, stones weighing several tons could be lifted slowly into place. One breath at a time. There was no roar, no triumphal shout, only the gentle murmur of effort, the creak of hemp rope, and the birds circling high above the columns still waiting to rise. As twilight stretched across the city and lanterns were lit along narrow streets, the quarry returned to rest. Tools were stored. Hands were washed in shallow basins, and meals were shared in quiet. The mountain, newly scarred, fell silent once more, its marble having begun a new journey, not to shine, but to serve. And so, piece by piece, in the calm between days, the temple grew not by miracle, but by intention, and the slow, thoughtful rhythm of those who shaped the earth with patience. As more marble rose into place, the Parthenon did not grow like a building, but like a thought slowly forming. A careful alignment of vision and material. Softened by time, the Athenian air was dry, light, and sharp, favorable for building, but it also meant every imperfection would be visible. Under the midday sun, shadows were crisp edges pronounced, any misalignment rendered honest by the clarity of light. So the architects Iktinos and Kallikrates studied the passage of the sun across the site before deciding where each line would run. What? They walked the hill at morning, at noon, at dusk, taking note of how light touched stone, not simply to illuminate, but to emphasize. Measurements were taken not in inches, but in proportion. Not by instruments alone, but by sense. The Greeks held harmony in high regard, not as decoration, but as necessity. The length of the stylobate, the spacing of columns, the width of the frieze, all were derived from quiet mathematical relationships, ratios that echoed in music, in poetry, in the spaces between stars. To the casual eye, the Parthenon might appear perfectly symmetrical, but it is not. Oh, not one part of it is strictly straight, nor entirely parallel. Each line, each curve was adjusted minutely to correct for optical illusions. The base bows gently upward at the center. Columns lean inward. Even the corner columns are slightly thicker than the others. These adjustments were not errors, but choices, made slowly, after years of observation. Such choices demanded extraordinary care from the craftsmen. They could not simply copy one block from another. Each had to be sculpted for its specific place, its precise angle, its neighboring stones. Mistakes could not be hidden. Oh, no cement could fill a gap. No plaster could disguise an oversight. The marble would fit, or it would not. And so, the builders moved with caution. They measured twice, then once more. They tested joints with wooden mock-ups before carving the final stone. They passed plumb lines slowly down column shafts, listening to how they brushed the flutes. And when the measurements were satisfied, they paused not to celebrate, but to breathe. The sight became a kind of silent choreography, workers moving in loops, ascending and descending scaffolds. Teams of oxen pausing in the shade, their loads carefully eased to the ground, ropes gently swaying in the afternoon wind. There were no engines, no cranes, only gravity and an understanding of its temperament. At certain points in the day, a kind of hush settled over the site. Perhaps in the hour after lunch, when tools were momentarily still, or near dusk, when long shadows stretched across the hilltop, and birds returned to roost beneath the wooden scaffolding. In those moments, the unfinished temple seemed to breathe. Columns stood like tall reeds in the wind, not yet complete, but already grounded, already present. Below the hill, the city of Athens pulsed gently. Potters shaped clay by turning wheel. Children played in narrow alleys between homes. Merchants folded cloth in shaded stalls. Smoke rose in thin lines from cook fires. But atop the Acropolis, there was only the rustle of tunics and the sound of tools meeting stone. Times, work slowed to wait for materials, or for a new calculation, or for the wind to quiet. There was no rush. The Parthenon was not meant for immediate use. It was built for permanence, and permanence could wait. Even delays were folded into the rhythm. Some days, the builders stepped back entirely, especially during festivals or periods of religious observance. Then the scaffolds were quiet, the ropes hung loose, and the marble gleamed untouched beneath the changing sky. During these rests, planners reviewed their tablets, artisans sharpened their chisels, and laborers tended to small repairs, mending wooden supports, organizing stone fragments. Children of the workers wandered between the marble blocks, tracing the edges with curious fingers. In the stillness, the sight transformed into something dreamlike. Not a place of labor, but of hope. Each stone was numbered not in haste, but in conversation. Symbols and marks were etched softly into the corners, not to claim ownership, but to guide placement. These marks would later be hidden, sealed within the structure itself. Only those who laid the stones would remember them. And only for a while. As construction moved higher, the visual balance became more important. The entablature resting atop the columns required careful shaping to distribute weight and preserve the illusion of lightness. The marble here had to be carved with particular subtlety. Even the horizontal lines of the frieze were gently curved to prevent the appearance of sagging. The temple did not defy gravity. It understood it, and all of this was done by hand, by men who rose before the sun and walked dusty paths with slow certainty, by men who carried their tools wrapped in linen and stored them each night with reverence, by men who, even after decades of labor, might only witness one corner of the final structure completed, and still returned day after day to shape their part. Their names were not etched into the foundation. Their likenesses were not carved into the meadow, but their patience lives in every joint that does not crack, every block that sits flush without aid. When the winds picked up, cloth canopies were lowered to protect the working areas from dust. Torches were lit in shaded corners to allow carving into the evening. Voices dropped to whispers. As the hour grew late, there was no need to speak loudly. The people listened, and as night arrived fully, the sight emptied slowly. Marble, once bathed in golden light, faded to ash tones beneath the stars. Shadows deepened in the flutes of the columns. Lanterns flickered beside sleeping oxen. The ropes hung still. Somewhere far below, a lyre might sound from a courtyard, the notes drifting up, soft as breath, and the Parthenon, though unfinished, held its place in the dark, as if it had always been there. No command echoed louder on the Acropolis than the soft tap of bronze on marble, repeated again and again until stone yielded to form. Each chisel stroke was a sentence, quiet and deliberate, not written in ink or spoken in words, but pressed into stone with patience, by hands that knew the rhythm of resistance. Carvers, crouched low or balanced carefully on scaffolding, moved not with power, but with a kind of reverence. They were not shaping blocks, they were revealing them. The sculptors worked close to the stone, the way one might sit beside a stream and watch its current. Their tools were few, but well-loved. Fine point chisels for detail, broader ones for contour. Hammers weighted just right to encourage, not force. Brushes made from horsehair used to sweep away marble dust, before it had time to settle. And cloth, always cloth, to cradle the hand, to wrap the tool, to soften the moment between touch and strike. Most days began before the sky brightened, before the first cart rumbled up the hill, or a child called out in the agora. In that early silence, the sculptors gathered some still chewing bits of fig or breaking flatbread in their hands. They moved among the columns like wind among reeds, choosing where to begin or where to continue. The metopes, square panels between the beams above the columns, required the most careful attention. Each one was a scene in relief, shallow yet expressive. Myths told not with words, but with posture and gesture. A centaur rearing, a lapith drawing his arm to strike, figures carved just deep enough to catch the light, to throw a shadow that whispered of movement. These images were not decorations, but reminders of stories shared by fireside, of victories and warnings, of values the city held dear. And yet, the sculptors did not dramatize. Every face was measured, every line drawn with restraint. The goal was not spectacle, but quiet clarity. To shape a figure in marble is to understand its bones, muscles too, but especially balance. If the weight of a shoulder was wrong, the whole image would tilt. If a knee bent too sharply, the leg would seem to float. So the carvers studied not just the living, but the way stillness behaved. A bird at rest, hat curled, a man waiting for something unseen. They worked by daylight alone. No oil lamp could reveal the sun would later hide. So as the morning advanced, light swept across the panels, shifting the carver's view. What looked complete in one moment would reveal imbalance in the next. And so they returned to it, adjusted a line, softened a crease, shaped again. When mistakes were made, and they were not erased. The block might be set aside, reused elsewhere. Sometimes reshaped into a drum for a column. Sometimes buried among the foundations, where no eye would find it. The Parthenon did not hide imperfection. It absorbed it, folded into its making like the uneven grain of wood within a finished table. At times, the sculptors whispered to one another, not in critique, but in shared understanding. A suggestion for a pose, a warning about a vein in the marble, a story from the quarry. They were not masters and apprentices alone. They were a community of hands, each aware of the other's work, even if they never touched the same stone. Elsewhere in the temple, friezes unfolded along the walls, long, continuous processions of figures, men, horses, gods, all moving forward in one eternal motion. These required not only skill, but restraint, for though the subjects were divine or noble, their depiction remained calm. No figure shouted, no limb stretched beyond its border. Even the horses seemed to march rather than gallop. The placement of these friezes was careful. Some faced outward to catch the sun and greet the city. Others rested behind columns, seen only by those who stepped close, and still others wrapped around interior walls, visible only to priests or those who carried offerings. In this way, the temple held layers of seeing, Public, private, sacred, not divided. Just quiet. When the midday heat arrived, tools were laid down. Cloths soaked in water were pressed to brows. The sculptors sat in the shade of the rising temple, backs against cool stone, eyes closed. Bread was shared, wine diluted with water, sometimes a fig passed from hand to hand. Laughter came softly. So did the wind. Then work resumed not from pressure, but from pull. The stones called for their finish. Half-shaped figure was like an unfinished thought. It lingered. The temple's inner chambers also began to take shape. Darker than the open porticos, quieter still. Here, the Athena Parthenos would someday stand a statue of immense scale, yet unseen by most. The space around her was already being formed. Walls cooled by the thick marble, floor smoothed with care, steps counted and recounted, so the visitor would arrive not suddenly, but gently. No one sculptor could see the whole. No one mason knew every block, but each understood their part, and that it belonged. There was comfort in that, in knowing that precision did not require grandeur, only attention, only time. As shadows grew longer and the light turned golden, the carvings changed character. What was clear at noon became softer, more mysterious. The folds of a robe seemed deeper. A face turned just so caught the fading light like a lantern. And as the sun slid down the sky, the chisels voiced, quieted, tools returned to linen wraps, dust brushed from knees. Carvers stepped back, looking not at their figures, but through them into what might come next. Then they left, walking slowly down the hill, past olive trees, past watchers and workers still lifting stone, and behind them the unfinished temple held its silence, a silence full of work, of stories, of hands that whispered into marble. Before the Parthenon rose into the Athenian sky, before its columns caught the dawn light or its friezes told stories in shadow, there was only soil, stone, and the memory of fire. Beneath the current temple lies the ghost of another one built and burned before this marble dream began. The older Athena temple, sometimes called the pre-Parthenon, had stood on the same ground, its footprint pressed into the dust like a forgotten script. During the Persian invasion of 480 BCE, when the city was abandoned and the Acropolis left vulnerable, that first structure was set aflame. Only the charred remains of its foundations and scattered debris told the tale afterward. The new builders years later did not remove these remnants. They worked around them, above them, acknowledging the past not with erasure, but with layering. As new stones arrived from the quarry and old ones were re-evaluated, the ground was studied not as an empty canvas, but as a palimpsest, each layer of earth carrying a trace of what came before. Masons moved through the site slowly, tapping the ground with polished staffs, listening for hollows, watching for subtle shifts, where the ground had softened from old burnings or shifted from rain. It was packed carefully. Where fragments of past columns remained, they were recorded, not drawn. There were no grand schematics, but noted, passed along in soft conversation from one craftsman to another. The foundation had to carry more than weight. It needed to absorb memory, balance time, and hold steady against the long breath of the centuries. Builders dug trenches, shallow at first, then deeper. The earth was dry, reluctant to yield. They lined the channels with layers of small stones, each hand placed like puzzle pieces fitting into silence. Over these, larger foundation blocks were laid rougher than the polished drums of the columns. But no less important, these base stones would never be seen again. Once in place, they would rest beneath everything, hidden beneath footsteps, beneath ceremony. Each block was tilted slightly to test its fit, struck softly with the butt of a hammer to hear its voice. If it rang clear, it stayed. If not, it was adjusted. No mortar bound them, only pressure, patience, and understanding. Wedges were used to ease them in. Wooden levers helped shift them by inches. Ropes and pulleys allowed adjustment without force. It was not brute strength that set the base, but the weight of experience passed through hands. Along the edges of the site, drainage channels were carved into the rock. Athens was dry much of the year, but when rain came, it came swiftly. The builders knew that water was not an enemy, so long as it had a place to go. These channels, some no wider than a hand's breadth, carried runoff gently away from the foundation. Stone covers were laid over the top, carved with faint notches to mark their purpose. These were not decorative, but functional and essential. Scattered among the building site were shallow pits, some circular, some square, used to store tools or water, or perhaps offerings. No one left them unconsidered. Each cavity was part of the temple's rhythm. Even the placement of steps, the width of corridors, the spacing between foundation blocks, all followed a logic that was not mathematical alone, but experiential. They had walked these distances before. They knew how long it took to turn between columns, how wide a cart might be, how far the sun reached at noon. At the center of the temple, the cella, its inner chamber, began to take shape from the earth up. Its foundation stones were the most carefully selected, their surfaces smoothed before placement. This was to be the space where the goddess herself would stand. Not a living woman, but a towering statue of Athena, rendered in gold and ivory. Still, the builders treated the ground as if preparing for a guest. Small shrines and offerings dotted the outskirts of the site. Tiny oil lamps, broken bits of pottery, figures left behind by those who passed by during construction. Some workers bowed briefly before starting the day, not in worship, but in acknowledgement that this place, though still dust and rubble, was becoming something beyond its parts. Foundation stones bore no names, no maker's mark. They were not meant to be seen, but every so often, beneath a slab, a mason would leave a small gift, a shell from the sea, a folded scrap of linen, a smoothed pebble, not to be found, but simply to belong. As the structure rose higher, and the scaffolding reached above the walls. The foundation remained still. It did not settle. It did not shift. And as each layer was added above, it held not just the building, but the weight of intention, of vision. The workers above rarely looked down, but they felt the certainty beneath their feet, the same certainty felt by those who passed through the city gates and glanced up toward the Acropolis. The temple was not finished, but its base was true. At night, when the tools were quiet and the lanterns dimmed, the air around the foundation grew cool. Stone cooled slowly. Dust settled into stillness, and below the marble, below the footsteps, the ground held its breath. There is something comforting in that, in knowing that what lies beneath need not be perfect, only present, and strong, and quiet. And so, beneath each drum, beneath each frieze and column and architrave, the Parthenon rested softly upon dust and memory. High above the city, as the Parthenon slowly reached toward the sky, it did so not with leaps, but with lifting stone by stone, guided it by rope, wood, and will. The hill itself was steep, uneven, and in places narrow. Oxen and carts could not carry marble up to the highest ledges, and so the builders devised systems simple at first, then increasingly clever. Wide earthen ramps stretched along the southern slope, curving gently to accommodate weight. These ramps were not permanent. They were born of necessity, shaped and reshaped over time by footsteps, by rainfall, by the repeated movement of wood against soil. Each morning, the ramps were inspected logs laid crosswise to support wheel ruts, sand packed into soft spots, stones removed by hand. Men moved in small groups, dragging sledges behind them, calling out softly when the slope grew steep. Others stood intervals, ready to wedge planks beneath wheels or to sprinkle olive oil onto the runners, easing friction. And always the ropes hempen, twisted, sun-dried, strained, and creaked with the slow music of labor. No winches, no cranes, just the same forces known to children, dragging toys uphill, magnified. The pulleys were of wood, carved carefully and replaced often. Ropes looped through them, guided by calloused hands. Stones were lifted not with might, but with teams. Dozens of men walking in slow circles around a central axle, like spokes in a living wheel. As they walked, the rope wound in, the stone rose. When they stopped, the rope was braced with wedges or pinned against posts. Balance was everything. A single sway in the wrong direction, and the marble drum might shift or crack. So each lift began with silence, a moment to breathe, to check the knots, the pulleys, the slope of the scaffolding. Then the signal, a nod, a hand raised, and the movement began. From the base of the Acropolis, it must have looked like a slow procession of floating stone. The great white blocks gliding upward between beams and ropes, disappearing at last behind sheets of linen, meant to shield the workers from wind and sun. But to those at the top, it was a constant negotiation. Every step upward had to be earned. Every corner turned required a plan. Once lifted, the stones were not simply placed, they were eased into alignment. Builders used small wooden sleds or rollers, adjusting their positions with levers and padded mallets. Chalk lines marked the center of columns. Strings hung with weights indicated plumb. At times, a stone might need to be turned rotated slightly until it settled into the exact shape carved to meet it. The joining of two drums required more than accuracy. It required empathy. The upper face of one block had to understand the lower face of the next. Builders placed thin slivers of lead between them, not to bind, but to even. And between these layers, wooden dowels or bronze clamps were inserted small bridges of trust within the stone. Occasionally, work paused not due to weather or shortage, but to allow the stone to settle. A newly lifted piece needed time to rest into its weight, to adjust. Builders would walk away for an hour, sometimes longer, and return to find the stone had shifted, not with failure, but with grace. In those pauses, they would rest beneath the scaffolding. Wooden beams creaked above, canvas flapped gently, dust floated in shafts of light like drifting pollen. Tools lay beside baskets of figs and flasks of water. Sometimes they spoke about the work, about family, about the weight of dreams. Other times, they were quiet. Above them, the structure grew not quickly, but inevitably. The pediments, those great triangular spaces at either end, would soon demand new kinds of skill. They would house sculpture, yes, but more than that, they would require intricate placement. The slope of the roof meant the figures had to be carved in perspective, tallest at the center, smallest at the edges so they appeared in harmony from below. It was the same illusion the entire temple depended on. Truth as seen through human eyes. And still, the ramps curved upward, used again and again until their paths hardened. The dust from oxen hooves mingled with marble shavings, with the ash of lunch fires, with rainwater that pooled in the grooves. Over time, the ramps would become part of the hill itself, then later removed. Slowly, once they were no longer needed, taken apart like scaffolding, like ladders after the fruit has been picked. But for now, they were vital. The ropes, too. Builders tested them daily, checking for fray or looseness. They tied them with practiced knots, designed not for beauty, but for memory. Knots taught from father to son. Knots that spoke a language of security. The dance of ropes and ramps was not glamorous. No inscriptions commemorate it, but without them, no stone would ever have risen. No temple would have touched the sky. As the light faded in the evening, shadows fell long across the slopes. Workers untied the final knots of the day, coiled the ropes into baskets, and covered pulleys with linen to protect them from dew. The ramps quieted. The wind moved gently through the posts, and in the hush, one might imagine the stones listening, waiting for tomorrow. And still, the temple held its place above the city, a little taller than the day before. As the columns neared their full height and the structure grew into the shape of a temple, not just an idea, The workers on the Acropolis turned their gaze upward, not toward the heavens, but toward the marble that, above the columns, above the smooth precision of stacked drums and fluted shafts, lay the task of assembling the entablature, the broad, weighty band of stone that spanned from column to column. It included the architrave, the frieze, and the cornice. These were not decorations alone. They were structure. They held not just form, but function. They were the ceiling's bones, and the weight was immense. Each block of the architrave, carved to rest precisely across the gap between columns, had to be lifted more than 30 feet into the air, and placed not loosely, not approximately, but exactly. Even the smallest error would crack a stone, or worse, create imbalance that might not reveal itself until much later, under the pressure of years. The cranes, if they could be called that, were built entirely of wood, tall, tripod-like structures with rotating drums at their core. Ropes wrapped around these drums were drawn slowly by men walking in circles on horizontal treadwheels, huge hollow cylinders like spinning barrels. Inside, the men paced steadily, their steps raising the stone inch by inch, foot by foot. They could not see the top. They could not see the placement. They moved to the rhythm of trust. Above, workers waited on platforms, braced between scaffolds, calling out softly, guiding the lift, watching for sway, watching for tension. When the stone reached its intended height, it hovered in the air, turning slightly on the rope like a leaf caught in a breeze. Then, with ropes tied to its sides, it was pulled inward, shifted into position with small levers and cautious nudges. Once in place, the block settled slowly, and the breath held across the entire site was released, not in applause, not in cheer, but in a quiet exhale, like air leaving a bellows. Each architrave block was numbered and paired with the columns it spanned. These numbers were not decorative, but essential. They ensured that each piece matched the subtle variation in spacing, in tilt, in curve. Nothing on the Parthenon was truly identical. Not the columns, not the stones. All shared proportion, but none were copies. Each was an answer to a particular question of light, of balance, of perspective. Above the architrave came the frieze, a continuous band of sculpted figures carved in low relief. In the Parthenon, this frieze wrapped around the inner chamber's outer wall, hidden behind the colonnade, visible only to those who stepped within. It told the story of a procession of horsemen, elders, maidens, and offerings, a quiet pageant carved not in celebration, but in reverence. To install it, the workers had to lift each panel high, guiding it behind the columns, between the scaffolds, into shadows. Torches were lit in the dim spaces to allow alignment. Bronze clamps were inserted between blocks to secure them, hidden within shallow grooves, sealed with molten lead. Of the frieze, the cornice began to take shape. These stones were angled, shaped with precision to form the roofline. They would support the pediments, those great triangular spaces at the temple's front and back. The cornice extended outward, forming eaves that cast long, protective shadows over the frieze below. Their underfaces were carved with patterns, triglyphs, and metopes in repeating rhythm, like musical notes set into marble. The placement of these upper stones was more than a task. It was a balance between fear and faith. Each lift risked failure. Each placement demanded stillness. And yet, day after day, the workers returned. They tested ropes. They tapped wooden beams to check for rot. They sharpened their chisels. They watched the sky for signs of wind. When clouds gathered, work stopped. Gusts could catch a stone mid-lift, could sway a scaffold, could tangle the ropes. And so, when wind came, the site grew still. Men took shelter beneath canvas or stone. They drank water, sat close, repaired their sandals, checked their tools. They waited, and when the sky cleared, they began again. Each evening, the high stones caught the final light of the day. Long after the city fell into shadow, the cornice glowed, faintly gold, like a line of fire edging the sky. Below, the ramps and ropes dimmed. The workers descended quietly, steps measured, tools bundled in cloth. The drums of the tread wheels ceased their turning. The air cooled. Sometimes, in the quiet that followed, an owl would pass overhead, its wings silent, its presence known only by the shifting of air. And the temple, though not yet complete, would seem to exhale, its stones freshly placed, holding not just weight, but rest. The weight of the sky had been lifted once more. With care. By now, the Parthenon had begun to resemble its final form, though no one said it aloud. To say it was nearly finished would have been premature. And perhaps ungrateful, for even as its great frame stood visible above Athens, lined in white against the blue of the Attic sky, every day still brought the weight of refinement. The columns, long lifted and fluted, were no longer just structure. They had become company. Moving among them was like walking through a quiet forest, their shafts like trunks, their bases like roots pressed into marble soil. They did not echo when touched, but they answered with a low warmth. Crows nested in the scaffolding now, not in droves, but in pairs, black figures perched between ropes and rafters, watching. They arrived early, before the workers, and lingered long after tools were laid down, their cries soft, guttural, brief, added a note of rhythm to the otherwise gentle silence. The workers paid them no mind. Perhaps they even welcomed them. In the days that stretched long with repetition, the birds were a kind of constant. They stood on lintels, hopped from drum to drum, sometimes stole bits of linen or dropped olive pits from the wall, and all the while, the temple grew beneath their wings. Within the colonnade, the inner chamber began to take shape with new precision, its walls tall and pale, pressed inward slightly, angled so subtly that only a careful observer might notice. This, too, was by design, to correct the eye's tendency to see straight walls as bowing. The temple's entire geometry was a quiet conversation with human perception. Along the inner steps, craftsmen carved shallow grooves, channels to collect water, to guide it away from the structure. Above, narrow gaps between stones allowed for expansion in heat, compression in cold. The builders understood not just stone, but season, the way sun and rain and frost visited the city not as enemies, but as rhythms. At the back of the temple, behind the cella, lay the opus thedomos, a smaller chamber that would one day store offerings, treasures, and records. Its walls, less ornate, were still given the same care. The masons there spoke less often, perhaps because their space was darker, quieter, set apart from the bustle of the outer court. Their hands moved just as carefully, their measurements just as true. The roof began to rise in segments, each rafter, carved from cedar brought by ship from distant shores, was placed in line with the next. Though the structure was stone, the roof relied on timber, a lightness above the weight. The cedar resisted rot, carried a faint scent that lingered in the air even after the planks were cut and set. Tiles, shaped of baked clay, were laid one by one atop the wood. Some were curved, designed to overlap and guide the rain. Others were flat, trimmed to fit the eaves. At the corners, water spouts were placed, sculpted in the shape of lion heads, mouths open to carry runoff from the roof. Their expressions, caught somewhere between stoic and amused, gave character to the quiet edges of the sky among the flurry of construction. The birds remained, crows mostly, but sometimes doves. They gathered in the pediments, in the half-formed cornices, in the shadows of the roof beams. Workers learned to move around them, not to startle, not to chase, just to coexist. It was said, softly, and not as joke, that the birds would be the first to see the temple completed. Below the columns, the flagstones of the stylobate were being polished now, not to shine, but to soften, to welcome footsteps without harshness. Smooth stones were laid in arcs, in quiet patterns that echoed the curves above. At night, these paths caught moonlight, reflected it faintly toward the steps. Sculptors continued their work on the figures that would soon crown the pediments. These were the most elaborate carvings of all gods and goddesses, horses and heroes, frozen in the apex of the structure. When in the apex of the structure, the western pediment would depict the contest between Athena and Poseidon, the story of how the city received its name. The eastern pediment would show Athena's birth, rising fully formed from the head of Zeus. The scale was daunting. The central figures stood taller than a man. Those at the corners lay almost flat, foreshortened so that from below they still appeared upright. Sculptors worked on the ground at first, chiseling the larger forms before they were lifted. Then came the fine details, folds of fabric, curls of hair, fingers wrapped around spears or laurel branches. It was slow work, not tedious, but deliberate. To carve the curl of a lip or the bend of a knee required full attention and then restraint. At the top of the scaffolds, the placement of each figure required collaboration. And teams worked together to align the stone, to brace it, to secure it without haste. The roof line became a theater of slow motion, each gesture careful, each decision final. Below, among the columns, priests and citizens began to pass more often. They came not to worship yet. There were no ceremonies, no fire on the altars, but to see, to walk among the rising structure and feel its weight. Children stood beneath the columns and looked up, necks craned, eyes wide. Elders touched the stone and said nothing, just stood, as if listening. At sunset, the birds called out, short, low notes that echoed faintly between the drums. The workers gathered their tools, folded cloths, poured water from shallow clay jugs to wash their hands. Dust swirled low, catching the amber light. And still, the Parthenon stood not finished, not perfect, but present, among the columns, among the crows, among the dust of countless steps. It waited, not for applause, not for ceremony, just for the next day, and the next, long before the temple would host offerings or echoes of footsteps on ceremony days. It stood simply as stone under sky, and in those quiet intervals between labor and vision, the marble began to collect something more subtle than structure memory. Pentelic marble, drawn from the mountain with patience, carved with breath, lifted with care, had a quality unlike other stone. In sunlight, it was almost white, but with warmth, a honeyed hue just beneath the surface. At twilight, it blushed faintly rose, and when it rained, it darkened, deepened, until the entire structure looked as if it remembered something. Not just water, but time. Fire. The builders had always known that rain would come. Not often, but regularly enough that it had to be considered in every joint, every seam, every channel carved into the base of column. Water, if allowed to sit or seep, could pry apart what human hands had joined. And so the Parthenon's designers embraced the rain, not as threat, but as presence. Grooves along the stylobate led runoff toward hidden drains. Gaps between the upper courses of marble were left just open enough to permit expansion, compression, breath. Beneath the roof tiles, sheets of bronze or thin lead were pressed between joints to guide water toward spouts, those lion mouths placed at each corner, now fixed firmly in. And when the first rains came, during the later phases of construction, the temple did not flinch. It stood quietly as droplets struck the stone, pooled briefly in shallow carvings, then trickled along the paths prepared for them. The marble darkened, yes, but it did not complain. Instead, it seemed to settle more deeply into itself. The workers, during these storms, often paused, not because they feared the rain, but because the tools grew slippery, the scaffold slick, the ropes heavy, and so they gathered beneath temporary awnings, stretched between columns, or under the overhangs already complete. They sat on folded cloth, backs to stone still rough from quarry, and listened. Rain in Athens did not often roar. It arrived like a visitor, unannounced, and left the scent of olives and dust behind. The droplets tapped against marble like fingers finding rhythm. Times, water would strike a loose block or a patch of hollow ground, and the resulting echo would carry upward, bouncing softly through the unfinished chambers. Some workers used the pause to sharpen tools, others to sleep. A few would trace shapes into the damp stone dust with fingertips. Circles, names, symbols. These were not meant to last. The next gust of wind would erase them, and yet they drew them anyway. When the rain stopped, the marble held its dampness for a while, not unpleasantly, just as a memory, as if to say, I felt that, and I remain. As construction resumed, the builders took note of what the rain had touched. Some joints had expanded slightly. Some surfaces showed faint streaks where runoff had sought its course. Adjustments were made, tiny shims inserted, edges recouped. It was not correction, but refinement, listening to what the weather had revealed. Inside the temple, the floor was being laid now. Massive stone slabs, polished smooth, their joints so tight that even a whisper might struggle to pass between them. Beneath the slabs, sand and crushed limestone provided a soft bed, absorbent, pliant. If the ground shifted even slightly, the floor could adjust. Elsewhere, the ceiling beams of the pronaos, the temple's front porch, were installed. These were also cedar, though thinner than those in the inner chamber. Upon them rested more marble, more tiles, more weight, and yet, when walked upon, the stone gave no sound, no creak, or no echo, only stillness. Marble remembers pressure. It holds the shape of tools long after the hands are gone. It holds warmth after sunlight departs. It even holds the faint stain of water, if only briefly, as if reminding itself, I was touched by sky. As the days passed, workers began to move differently, slower, perhaps, not from fatigue, but from awareness. There was less to build now, more to refine. Each task took longer, not because it was harder, but because it was closer to final. Mistakes made now would be seen forever. And so, every brush of the chisel, every lift of the hammer was chosen carefully. In the afternoons, shadows began to linger longer beneath the colonnades. The sun, as it turned lower in the year, cast a different light across the marble. Builders began to see the temple not just as parts, but as a whole. They stood back more often, walked the length of the stylobate, squinted into the pediments. Some placed flat hands on the columns and simply stood, eyes closed, as if listening for movement. The rain returned from time to time, sometimes just a mist, sometimes a true storm. The crows took shelter beneath the roof tiles. Water slid down the flutes of the columns, collecting briefly on the bases before falling away. No one hurried. No one brushed it off. The temple absorbed it, not into weakness, but into presence. At night, The marble dried slowly. Under torchlight, it shimmered faintly, still damp at the corners, darkened at the joints. The lions at the roof corners dripped softly onto the flagstones below. Workers passed among them quietly, steps echoing with a hollow gentleness, and above all, the Parthenon stood, not just in stone, but in season, a structure not untouched by weather, but shaped by it, not resisting time, but remembering. Now that the Parthenon's form had emerged fully, its marble skeleton lifted into light, its shadows in place, its roofline clear against the sky, it would have been easy to imagine that the great work was done. But to those who built it, the final stage was the most delicate. Not because the lifting had ended, but because the unseen work had begun. Beneath the visible, there was weight that must be borne, and weight that must be hidden. Stone does not balance itself. It is not merely stacked. It is persuaded, aligned, adjusted, and in the Parthenon, where every visible line had been shaped to trick the eye into seeing harmony, the invisible lines mattered more than ever. The workers now turned their focus inward, behind the sculptures, beneath the floor. Inside the walls they moved like caretakers tending a sleeping animal, quiet, careful. There were iron clamps to place between marble blocks, simple U-shaped pieces, hammered by hand, fitted into carved sockets, then sealed with lead to protect them from air and rust. These clamps would never be seen, never named in scroll or song, but without them, the temple would not endure. There were dowels, two small rods of bronze or wood, driven between joints to hold blocks in unity. They were fitted dry, sometimes wrapped in linen soaked in resin, then pressed firmly into place. These tiny bridges, these unseen agreements between stones, kept the temple from drifting apart over decades, over centuries. In corners, counterweights were added, small stones, lead cores, intentional shifts of mass. These were placed where needed, based on experience more than math. The builders did not speak of them. They simply knew. They would feel a column's lean with the flat of a palm. They would hear a difference in the chisel's song when tapping one side of a drum versus the other. Balance was not just structural. It was sensed at the roof line as the cornices were secured. Wind bracing was quietly installed, wooden struts between beams, diagonal supports hidden beneath the marble. These were not beautiful, but they were essential. They held the temple steady against the sudden gusts that swept in from the sea. Across the attic plain, on the stylobate, drainage gaps were widened minutely, not with tools, but with pebbles pushed and twisted to smooth the stone's edge. Where puddles had once lingered after rain, they no longer formed. The temple, though solid, had learned to breathe. Even the steps were adjusted. Some smoothed further, others lifted slightly to ensure an even rise. Workers moved across them slowly, sandals whispering on the stone, pausing where their foot caught, noting where a shadow gathered too sharply. A few chisels were still in use, but now they tapped rarely, only when necessary. It was no longer a sound of shaping, but of tuning. Inside, Scaffolds were being dismantled. Wooden beams, stained from weather, marked with chalk and rope, were lowered carefully and carried away. Each removal felt ceremonial, as if the temple were waking from a long sleep. Above, in the pediments, final figures were fixed in place. The last sculptures were guided gently into their niches. Horses with wind in their marble manes, gods with folded robes, mortals caught mid-step. Figures were braced from behind, secured with clamps. No one would see the supports, but all would feel the result. Stillness at night when the workers were gone and the city lay quiet. The temple stood more completely than ever, not because more had been added, but because what had been hidden was now holding. From the foot of the Acropolis, the marble shimmered faintly in moonlight. No torches were lit on site, but the white stone glowed just enough, its proportions now full, its silence complete. A few citizens still wandered up to see. They walked among the columns slowly, placing hands on the fluted shafts, heads tilted upward. No guides led them. No gods blocked paths. The temple was open, though not yet consecrated. And in the half-light, it was possible to believe that the marble itself remembered its journey, from mountain to platform, from wedge to chisel, from breath to balance. None of the names of those who worked these final days would be carved into the stone, but their decisions, their quiet choices, would hold the structure long after they were dust. They were the unseen hands of balance. They did not build for applause, but for permanence. And so the Parthenon stood gathered into itself now, no longer a project, but a presence. Still waiting. By now, the Parthenon had become a thing, not only seen, but felt. Every groove along its columns, every shallow dip across its steps, every quiet channel carved into the stone bore more than function. They bore rhythm, and like lines in a palm, they told of time not as calendar days, but as patient labor, etched slowly into permanence. Most prominent among these were the flutes, the vertical channels carved along the outer surface of each column. From a distance, they seemed mere decoration, but to those who carved them, they were a discipline of restraint and a dialogue with light. Each column, depending on its position, received a different quality of sunlight. Those on the east met the day with a clear blaze, those to the west a softer dusk. To shape the flutes evenly meant not only measuring by hand, but understanding how the sun would play among them. Deepen them too much, and they would seem harsh. Shallow them, and they would disappear in shadow. And so, the stonemasons worked with lead compasses, with tightly stretched cords, with sharpened chisels, stroked in slow, steady arcs. There were 20 flutes on each column, no more, no less, but each one was redrawn by the eye, guided by the fall of light on marble, by the curve of the drum beneath. The smallest deviation was adjusted with soft taps, not to correct, but to listen. Within each groove, rain would sometimes gather and run, tracing the same path the chisel had made. In this way, the flutes became tiny rivers, and though invisible in purpose, they reduced the column's weight without weakening it. They added softness to the structure and whispered motion into what otherwise would be still. Elsewhere, grooves served humbler purposes. At the base of walls, along the thresholds, narrow runnels were cut to catch dust, to guide water, to prevent pooling. These were not detailed in scrolls or plans. They were the result of hands and eyes knowing the behavior of stone, of weather, of feet. In the inner chambers, along the floor where few would ever walk, faint indentations marked the paths of heavy loads once carried in. Statues, perhaps, or great bronze cauldrons, or timber too thick to hoist above the roofline. The grooves left by these burdens were not intentional, but they remained, smoothed over by time. They curved gently toward corners, toward doorways, like forgotten footprints. Near the opistodomus, the rear room of the temple, deeper grooves were carved into the stone threshold, faint, parallel tracks, barely visible except in raking light. These, it was thought, were made to guide doors. Not simple doors, but great wooden panels mounted on pivots, their weight offset by bronze hinges. The grooves allowed them to swing cleanly, without friction, without sound. Now, with no doors yet installed, the grooves remained as intentions, patient lines waiting for completion. In the colonnade, the floor slabs bore soft wear from sandals and cartwheels. These were not carved, they were earned. And though construction still neared its final stages, the movement of hundreds had already begun to tell its story. The workers, the architects, the priests, the children weaving between stones. They had left their marks not with tools, but with repetition. Even the ropes, drawn across the marble again and again, had left faint lines. Where pulleys once hung, the beams were rubbed smooth. Where scaffolding had leaned, the stylobate bore pressure points small, nearly invisible bruises in the stone. All of this, part of the record. And overhead, in the highest reaches beneath the roofline, the ceiling beams showed tool marks, long, shallow scores, from when they were shaped on the ground. These were not polished away. They were not meant to be seen, but in the dim space between marble and timber, they remain straight, honest. These grooves, these traces spoke softly of movement, of work, of presence. They did not declare themselves. They waited for those who looked closely. One craftsman, nearing the end of his day, ran his fingers along a flute he had shaped months before. He paused at a section slightly shallower than the rest. He did not frown. He did not correct it. Instead, he rested his hand there for a moment, then moved on. That one line would remain as it was, not an error. Her breath. Outside, the crows had returned. They landed between columns, walked along the stylobate, pecked gently at a piece of fruit left behind. The wind stirred, not strong, but enough to set loose cords to sway. Shadows danced briefly along the grooves, then disappeared again. At sunset, the lines carved into the marble caught gold, not with brilliance, but with hush. Each groove, deep or shallow, glowed for a moment, a thin memory of every hand that shaped it, a record of labor that did not shout, did not need to, because in the Parthenon, grooves were not damage, they were direction. In the early days of the Parthenon's construction, the sound of tools had been constant chisels, striking marble, ropes groaning under weight, the deep rhythm of tread wheels turning stone into flight. But now, as the temple neared its quiet completeness, those sounds had faded, replaced by something softer. There was silence, and it was full. Not emptiness, not abandonment, but a silence earned, settled into like dust into a groove, like breath at the end of a long day. The builders still work, but their motions no longer require declaration. The hammers, once full of voice, now waited long between strikes. The chisels rested more often in folded cloth than in hand. The work was no longer about raising, but about noticing, a misaligned join that needed a whisper of adjustment, a surface left just rough enough to catch light harshly at noon, a corner that absorbed rainwater where it should have let it fall. These were the final tasks, invisible to all but those who had touched every part of the temple before. The artisans had grown older with the structure. Some had been young when the foundations were laid. Their hands, once quick, were now deliberate, their steps slower but wiser. They knew which marble would cool too quickly in shadow, which stone remembered the warmth of a builder's palm long after sunset. And so, they walked the temple, not like masters inspecting work, but like caretakers of a slumbering animal. They paused at corners, listened for the way air moved through the columns, felt the stone with bare fingers in the early morning, when the chill still lingered. The temple itself seemed to respond. Its stillness deepened. It no longer demanded lifting or pulling or carving. It only needed presence. There were still hammers, yes, but they struck not with rhythm, but with restraint. A tap here, another after minutes of consideration. The sound echoed softly against the marble, like a raindrop in an empty hole. When it stopped, the silence returned, and it felt larger than before. At times, a mason might kneel in the shadow of a column, not to work, but simply to think, to let the shape of the drum settle into his eyes again, to remember the day it was first hoisted into place, to recall the rope burn across his shoulder, the call of the pulleys, the slow turning of the wheel. There were no deadlines, no pressure to finish, only the awareness that the temple would one day be called complete, and that each gesture made before that moment mattered. Within the cella, the inner sanctuary, the space was being swept and cleared. The great statue of Athena, once imagined in golden brilliance, was not yet built, but the room around her was being finished with care. The floor polished, the walls checked for seam and shadow, the ceiling cleaned of dust from past chisels. The temple was making ready not for use, but for rest. Elsewhere, among the porticos, workers knelt with fine abrasives, rubbing stone with cloth, not to shine, but to soften. removing sharp edges, bright flakes, uninvited glints. The goal was not perfection, it was peace. There is a silence that arrives only after effort, not the stillness of waiting, but the stillness of arrival. That was the silence now. On the Acropolis, birdsong tarried farther than before. Footsteps echoed. Even the breeze between columns had a voice. And when someone spoke, they did so gently, as if not to wake something. In this quiet, the workers spoke less among themselves. Not from weariness, but from reverence. They knew the weight of the final gesture, how even a final wipe of cloth, or the brushing of dust from a crevice, was a kind of offering, and so they cleaned their tools slowly at day's end. Oilcloth over bronze, fingers pressed into the grain of wood. They set chisels back into wrapped bundles, hung ropes on wooden racks, folded rags along the steps. When they descended from the temple each evening, they did so without hurry, without speech, only the gentle crunch of gravel beneath sandals. The path they walked was lined with olive trees, now old, even then, and the scent of them followed all the way down. From below, in the evening haze, the Parthenon stood as it always had, but different. It was whole, and in its wholeness, it was silent, not because it lacked story, but because its story had been placed, piece by piece, into stone. By the time most hammers had grown still and scaffolds were gently folded away, the Parthenon stood beneath the Athenian sky, not only as a structure of marble, but as an alignment of ideas, pressed softly into angles. Nothing in its form was arbitrary. Every beam, every shadow, every space between columns held a purpose shaped by vision and adjusted by time. Even the angles, the simplest of architectural terms, were drawn, not with rulers alone, but with a kind of reverence. They did not simply measure, they guided the gaze, controlled the weight of light, whispered proportions to the passing eye. The builders knew what only patient work teach, the difference between exactness and harmony. Nowhere was this more visible than in the way the columns leaned not outward, not straight, but slightly inward, almost imperceptible. Each column tilted just enough that, if extended far beyond the roof, all would meet at a point high above. Quiet convergence, never seen, but always there, like a constellation of stone. And these angles had their companions. The stylobate, the very floor on which the temple rested, was not flat. It rose gently in a center, just a few fingers' width, creating a subtle curve. This curve corrected for the illusion of sagging that would have occurred had the base been made perfectly level. It was a trick of the eye, but the builders knew the eye well, and answered it kindly. Likewise, the columns themselves were not uniform cylinders. Each swelled slightly in the middle, a phenomenon known later as antithesis. This swelling countered the visual thinning that happens when tall shafts rise toward the sky. The result? Columns that seemed neither heavy nor thin, but poised, confident, at ease. Every spacing was thoughtful. Between columns, between tiles, between steps. The corner columns were set closer to their neighbors than those in the center. This, too, was a correction for the human eye, which perceives edges differently from the interior. In making these adjustments, the builders did not defy perception, they embraced it, folded it into the temple's design like a leaf tucked into parchment. These sacred angles were born not in haste, but in watchfulness. And so, the final days of construction were filled with observing. Workers moved through the temple, with heads tilted, watching how light fell between pillars in the early morning. They stepped back, walked wide circles, looked again at the silhouette against the sky. If something felt off, even if the numbers were correct, they considered it. They consulted not scrolls but shadows, not calculations, but instincts honed by years spent shaping stone in changing weather. Some days, no stone was touched. Instead, time was spent in study. Workers sat on unfinished steps, leaned against still warm marble, and simply watched. The sun would move across the frieze, casting changing shadows on the low-relief figures. Lines that appeared straight at dawn might seem to bow at noon. These observations were not problems to solve, but qualities to understand. In the high spaces, just below the roofline, final alignments were made with cords stretched between columns, taut lines that revealed subtle dips or peaks. A column that leaned slightly too far was not corrected with force. Instead, the joint beneath it was lifted, adjusted with the finest of shim's wedges, made of bronze or wood, sometimes no thicker than a fingernail. Elsewhere, angle irons were checked tools held up against cornices and steps, watching how the shadow curved. A mason might hold his palm flat against a surface, feeling for heat, for tilt, for the faint give that indicated misalignment. These gestures were not learned in school. They were passed down quietly from one builder to another, and as these final corrections unfolded, the temple took on something new, not just completion, but coherence. It was not only that the lines met, it was that they met with grace. Even the air seemed to understand. Moving gently through the columns, it flowed in patterns, some warm, some cool, following the shape of space. Birds paused longer on ledges. Their feathers caught the same golden light that brushed the edges of the pediments. The city below watched, or perhaps felt, that something settled was happening above. One worker, nearing the end of his final task, stood at the far corner of the temple and looked back along the colonnade. The angle from there revealed what most never saw: a depth of line, a convergence, the soft echo of one column into the next. He did not speak, but he only stood and blinked slowly as the wind moved past. These angles, these patient lines, had become more than technical choices. They were gestures of respect for the eye, for the viewer, for the sky itself. When the day dimmed and the final corrections were made, no grand announcement was offered. No voice called out completion. Instead, A soft hush passed among the workers, a shared sense that the last alignment had been found, that the temple stood not just tall, but right. The silence was deep, not final, but full, and in it, the sacred angles rested, waiting for their first dawn as part of a whole. By now, the Parthenon no longer felt like something in the making. It simply was, not loud, not even proud, just there, solid and still, and filled with breath, not the breath of lungs or voices, but the kind that comes when something living exhales after a long task, a low, steady rhythm that settles into walls, into steps, into the very dust that softens the path. Though no official dedication had been declared, the workers knew the final days had arrived. There were no more deliveries from the quarry, no more carts groaning up the hill, no more ropes stretching between scaffolds. The scaffolds themselves were gone now, disassembled quietly, their beams stacked to be repurposed elsewhere. The temple had emerged from behind its framework like a statue uncovered already known, yet somehow surprising in its stillness. And in this stillness, everything felt slower. The days passed gently, not with rush, but with observation. People began to move through the temple, not as builders, but as witnesses. They spoke in quieter tones, touched the marble with open palms, not to test for fit or flaw, but simply to acknowledge, "You're finished now." Within the inner chamber, the cellar workers swept and rinsed the floor. The space remained bare. The statue of Athena, planned for the central place, had not yet arrived. Its sculptor worked elsewhere, far from the site, but the room was ready. Light filtered in gently from narrow slits high in the walls, falling across the polished flagstones in long, soft bands. The air was cool, scented faintly of cedar from the roof beams, and of dust long settled. Visitors began to come, not in crowds, but steadily. Some brought baskets of figs or wreaths of olive branches. Others offered only footsteps. A few sat for hours on the stone steps just outside, watching the sky change behind the temple's long silhouette. They did not need explanations. The place spoke for itself. Even the birds had changed their rhythm. The crows, once constant companions during construction, now kept their distance, perching on the nearby walls or watching from olive trees below. Doves appeared more frequently now, not in flocks, but in pairs. They flew beneath the portico roof and settled near the base of the columns, cooing softly into the marble hush. The temple breathed with the day. In the morning, it warmed. In the afternoon, it shone. By evening, it cooled slowly, stone retaining heat from the sun like memory, releasing it just as gently into the night. The steps began to show faint wear from sandals. Not enough to scar, but enough to soften their sharpness. The flagstones carried the faint dust of the city, brushed clean each morning by attendants. Lamps were placed now in the corners, oil-filled terracotta vessels with slow burning wicks. At dusk, These were lit in silence. Their light was soft, flickering, barely reaching the high friezes above. And through all this, the breath of the temple continued. A rise in the morning, a hush at midday, a sigh in the evening. Those who spent time within its colonnades began to match its rhythm without realizing it. Voices slowed, steps softened, time seemed to stretch gently. The Parthenon was no longer being built. It was being held by the hill, by the air, by the city that had grown around its gaze. One mason, whose tools had long since been stored away, returned in the early morning alone. He carried nothing. His sandals were worn, his shoulders slightly curved from years of labor. He walked through the eastern portico, past the columns he had helped lift, across the floor he had helped align. When he reached the center, he sat. No one disturbed him. He sat for a long time, saying nothing, doing nothing, only watching the light move across the floor and breathing with it. Above, the marble ceiling held its silence. The lions at the corners still waited for rain. The friezes caught the gold of morning, then let it go. The city below was waking, market stalls opening, carts creaking across stone, voices rising into the streets. But here, within the temple, time slowed again, as if the air itself remembered the years of lifting, carving, measuring, and had chosen to let them rest. No prayers were spoken aloud, no rituals performed, not yet. But the temple did not need them not to be sacred. It was sacred already, because it was built with breath, and patience, and hands that never rushed, and now it was ready to hold all that would come. Even in stillness, the Parthenon remained a geometry of motion lines and curves that did not move, yet always seemed to flow. It was never just a building. It was a pattern, a measured language written in stone, meant to be walked, seen, felt, not solved. The kind of geometry not scribbled in wax or dust, but lived through time, breath, and intention. Visitors who approached the Parthenon for the first time did so quietly. Perhaps it was the scale that hushed them, or the way. The columns, nearly 50, in all rows from the stylobate. Not in rows of repetition, but in cadences, like pauses in speech. Each step forward brought a new perspective. Lines bent, merged, vanished. Shadows shifted. The temple did not just occupy space, it shaped it. Every proportion followed an ancient rhythm, not the cold austerity of exact ratios, but the warmth of harmonious ones. The length of the stylobate was just about twice its width. The number of columns along the long side was not arbitrary 8 along the front, 17 along the sides. The interior rooms followed the same principle, echoing those numbers with rows of inner columns, doorways, and spacing. And yet, these patterns were not rigid. They were softened by curves, softened by context. This was reverence not of worship alone, but of attention. To stand inside the Parthenon's portico was to feel both protected and open. The ceiling stretched overhead like a canopy of silence, but the colonnades invited the world in light, wind, sky. One could walk from brightness into shade and back again, all while staying beneath the same roof. The temple never confined. It clarified. Within the inner sanctuary, the space narrowed, but only just. Enough to draw the eye toward the place where Athena would stand. Once installed, enough to pull thought inward, gently, not with grandeur or pressure, but with suggestion. Even without her statue, the geometry held her, and still the lines continued, beyond the visible. The floor, though polished, had an ever so slight incline near the doorway, barely felt underfoot. The walls leaned inward, as did the columns, guiding not just structure, but sight. To walk the path between the colonnades was to follow invisible channels like water drawn through a carved basin. Those who knew the temple intimately, architects, priests, stonecutters, could sense this geometry without measuring, could walk blindfolded and feel the change in air at the turning of a corner. They knew how footsteps echoed differently between the east and west ends, how the breeze moved faster beneath certain archways, and those new to it, they too noticed something, even if they could not name it. Children, when allowed within, often walked the perimeter once, then paused, then walked it again, slower, as if mapping something unspoken, as if drawn by the rhythm itself. Their fingers brushed the stone absently, their voices soft. Adults stood still for longer. They walked only to sit, or to turn once, looking back at the entrance to see what had changed. The answer was nothing, and everything. Outside, the temple's angles framed the sky. In the morning, the eastern portico opened onto pale light. In the evening, the western end caught the setting sun between its columns, casting long shadows across the slope. Birds often flew straight through these spaces, passing from one side to the other as though through open gates. No one stopped them. The temple offered no barriers, only passage. The geometry of reverence was not the same as that of rule. It did not demand symmetry. It suggested harmony. It did not insist on direction. It offered alignment. And so, even the wind obeyed its rhythm, curling between the columns, then pausing in the spaces of still air beneath the roof. Light filtered differently through each gap. No moment inside the Parthenon was exactly like another. The same walk, taken twice, would yield a different sound, a different hue, a different breath. This was its purpose, not permanence in form alone, but in feeling, a space that remembered how it was shaped, and in doing so, shaped all who entered. The geometry was not static. It was alive. It listened. It guided. It held. And the Parthenon, in its quiet watch over the city, became more than a temple. It became a place to stand within a pattern and to feel, if only briefly, completely alive. By now, the grand form of the Parthenon had come fully into being. And yet, all around it, small tasks remain, pieces not forgotten, but saved for the end. Those finishing touches, too fine to rush, too delicate to be hurried. These were the fragments, not the great drums or architraves, not the pediment sculptures or fluted columns, but the smaller stones, the slender edges, the tiny junctions where one element gave way to the next, pieces no taller than a knee, pieces that would never catch the full light of morning, nor the full gaze of the crowd, but they mattered just as deeply. Every temple, no matter how grand, is held together by what is almost invisible. And so, the final artisans moved with care, not in the center, but at the margins. They walked along the stylobat's edge, checking the fit of narrow blocks between steps and walls. They crouched in the corners of porticos, adjusting where a line might have wandered. They sat in the shadows among the lion-headed spouts and gutter stones, refining grooves that would only ever be touched by rain. Some carried baskets of chips and splinters, leftovers from carving, saved not for waste, but for fitting. These were used to fill tiny voids, to brace a misaligned joint, to press into place like punctuation at the end of a sentence. The chips were not discarded. They were part of the structure's memory, returned to the form they came from. Elsewhere, the bronze clamps were hidden beneath marble covers, thin panels shaped precisely to lie flush with the surrounding stone. These were fixed with melted lead, poured gently into channels, then cooled with water-soaked cloths. The lead hissed softly as it met the stone, then hardened, then disappeared. In the shadow of the pediment, stonemasons worked on the raking cornice, the final angled stones that sealed the temple's form. They shaped them by touch more than sight, running hands along the curve until the surface felt as it should. Smooth, but not slick. Precise, but not cold. They knew these pieces would face the sky more than the eye, but that was enough. Each day, more of the temple passed from tool to time. The frieze, now complete, was brushed clean with stiff reed brushes, not to polish, but to remove the fine dust that gathered in carved folds and between fingers of marble figures. The process was slow, quiet, reverent, as if the brushes were offering thanks, not labor. Fragments of broken stone accidents from years past were gathered now. Not all could be used. Some bore cracks too deep, flaws too hidden. These were stacked at the hill's edge, near the path descending to the agora. They would not be wasted. In time, they might become thresholds, paving stones, or altars in the shade. Even among the discards, there was dignity. One young apprentice spent the day aligning a single block, small, square, inconspicuous. It fit near the rear wall, between the base of the Opus Domos and a drainage path. No one would likely notice it, but he placed it, lifted it, adjusted it, brushed its sides, and placed it again. By sunset, it sat so precisely that even the shadow it cast seemed aligned. At night, the lanterns burned low. The soft light caught the corners of these small pieces, the fragments laid with care, and gave them a quiet glow, not a shine, just enough for the builders to see them and to know they belonged. When the workers left each evening, the site no longer felt like a project. It felt like a place that had always been. The tools were fewer now, the dust less, but the temple's weight deeper, like something settling into its final breath. In the silence, the fragments spoke, not with stories, but with stillness, not with grandeur, but with grace. Because the temple, for all its height and harmony, was not only made from great stones and heroic plans, it was made from pieces touched, shaped, placed by hands that believed even the smallest part deserved to rest in perfection. As the final fragments were nestled into place and the dust settled for the last time, the Parthenon began its life not as a work in progress, but as a quiet presence upon the hill. It did not shimmer, it did not sing, it simply stood, wrapped in stillness, not the kind of stillness born from absence, but the stillness that follows intention, that sacred pause at the end of breath, the way a hand rests after carving, or a body leans into the last light of day. That is the stillness the temple now wore. Athens moved on below. Markets swelled with voices. Scribes carried wax tablets from stoves to steps. Potters fired clay. Children ran along narrow streets. Life continued bright, fast, loud. But up here, among the columns, the wind had a different pace. Visitors no longer came only to observe. They came to dwell, even if briefly, to sit on the steps, backs against warm marble, and allow the silence to unfold around them. Some brought offerings, small olive branches, baskets of fruit, carved tokens of bronze. They placed them gently near the eastern portico without announcement, and departed without waiting for acknowledgement. There were no ceremonies yet. The temple had not been consecrated, but the stillness suggested that something sacred had already begun. Even the birds moved more gently through the space. Doves glided from pediment to cornice. The wind ruffled their feathers. But they did not scatter. They lingered, just as shadows lingered beneath the colonnades, just as light lingered on the flutes of columns before slipping away. The builders, those who still came, did so now without tools. Some arrived early, before the city stirred. Others came in the blue hush before dusk. They walked slowly along the edges, touching the walls they had shaped, stepping carefully where the stylobate turned. Their fingers traced grooves they remembered chiseling years before. They did not speak. They didn't need to. The temple remembered them, and it offered them stillness in return. The priesthood had begun preparations for the statue of Athena, but word spread that she would not arrive for many months yet, that the sculptor Phidias was still shaping the ivory and gold elsewhere, that the temple, though built, would wait. And so it did. No one filled the cellar with sound. No one rushed to open its doors. The space remained quiet, breathing in the dust motes that drifted in morning light. The cedar beams above creaked faintly with heat. The flagstones carried the warmth of the sun long into the evening. The silence was not empty. It was expectant. Stillness can teach many things. It reveals which joints were fitted well, which surfaces were smoothed with extra care. It magnifies the faint echo of a sandal across stone. It allows one to hear not just the voice of wind through a column, but the change in tone from one portico to another. It shows where a shadow ends and begins again, and perhaps, most of all, it offers time. Time to remember the quarry, time to recall the feel of rope over shoulder, time to see the temple not as an object, but as a companion, a place that stood not to impress, but to endure. As seasons shifted, the light changed. Winter's low sun angled across the western steppes. Spring brought blossoms from nearby trees, their petals sometimes blown up the slope and scattered across the stylobate. Summer warmed the stone until it felt like flesh beneath the hand. Autumn cooled it again, made it firm, almost stern. But through all of it, the Parthenon held still, not static. Still, there is a difference. Stillness listens. It observes. It gathers. It holds the weight of what has come and what will come after. And in the Parthenon, that stillness grew deeper each day. Visitors began to bring their children. Some whispered the story of Athena and Poseidon, the contest of gifts, the salt spring, the olive tree. Others said nothing at all, allowing the temple to speak its own tale. And it did, in proportions, in breath, in the hush that greeted each footstep, and lingered long after it passed. In praise of stillness, the Parthenon needed no voice. It had already spoken, and now it waited, not to be filled, but to be witnessed. From the temple's highest step, if one turned slowly toward the horizon and narrowed their gaze through the marble colonnades, they could see it Mount Pentelicus, distant and pale, resting under the same sky that now crowned the Parthenon. It had always been there, quiet, patient, watching long before a single rope was drawn or a chisel struck. The mountain had offered its body, and now, in the calm after construction, it remained not diminished, but fulfilled. For the stones that once lay within its slopes now stood on this sacred hill, shaped and lifted, bearing not only weight, but meaning. Pentelic marble. It was said to have memory, and so perhaps the mountain remembered too. The builders spoke little of the quarry in these final days, but it lingered in their hands, in the lines of their backs, in the slow way they touched the temple's columns. Some had not returned to the mountain in years, but they remembered the path, the winding slope, the way the sun rose behind it, the dust that coated everything before the stone was even touched. Others had never left it. Quarrymen still worked there, now extracting smaller loads for altars, for minor repairs, for neighboring sanctuaries. The great blocks were no longer needed, but the mountain remained generous, yielding what it chose when asked with respect. From time to time, a load of stones still made its way from Pentelicus to the city. Fewer oxen now, no great ramps, only carts and careful hands. The roads had changed, the memory had not. At night, on the Acropolis, when the moon was high and shadows lay long across the temple floor, one could imagine the link between mountain and marble. as if each column remembered the slope from which it was born, as if each step held the cool scent of quarried rock. Still waiting for sunlight, there were moments, rare and quiet, when clouds would gather over Pentelicus and cast long shadows that stretched all the way to the temple itself. The builders, if present, would sometimes pause and look, not with awe, not with fear, but with familiarity, as if receiving a glance from an old friend. For the mountain had not only offered stone, it had offered rhythm, the pace of seasons, the patience of pressure, the weight of silence, and in every part of the Parthenon that rhythm remained. The marble still changed with light. It held heat, then released it slowly. It bore the faint scent of rain when storms passed through. When touched, it warmed beneath the hand, as if waking the connection between temple and mountain was not linear. It was circular. The tools that once shaped stone at Pentelicus were now buried deep in the storerooms beneath the temple. The dust that once clung to the arms of quarrymen now drifted across the Acropolis steps. Even the chisels, dulled from years of use, bore the marks of both places scarred from the mountain, rested in the temple. And so, to walk through the Parthenon was, in a way, to return to the quarry, not through sight, through feeling, the slope beneath the feet, the weight of light overhead, the calm of repetition, the understanding that shaping anything stone, space, stillness requires not just strength, but surrender. Now and then, a new visitor would arrive, a priest, foreign craftsman, a child from the city below. They would pass between the columns, gaze up at the pediments, and feel something they couldn't name. And if they looked east, past the edge of the steps, past the roofs of Athens, they would see the faint outline of Mount Pentelicus, like a memory resting beneath the sky. The temple did not point to the mountain, but it remembered it. In every joint, every groove, every silent echo, the mountain had watched as the stone was taken, and now it watched as the temple stood, not in grief, not in loss, but in witness, as one form of stillness gave shape to another. What does it mean to build for the divine, without ever driving a nail, to raise walls not with mortar, but with breath, to trust stone alone to hold itself, and more than itself? That is what the Parthenon did, and still does. No iron spikes run through its columns. No plaster fills its joint. No glue, no bonding agent. No secret seal. Only weight, only care, only the quiet agreement between shapes. Each block rests against its neighbor as if in conversation, listening, leaning in. The temple was not held together by force, but by understanding. 1,000 choices, each made slowly, led to this stillness. Stones shaped with intention, columns tapered to compensate for the eye's trick, surfaces curved to appear straight, and joints those invisible seams so perfectly aligned that even centuries later, wind can pass between them without sound. To hold the gods, it was believed, the temple must first hold silence, and so Everything unnecessary was left aside. The walls of the Parthenon do not overwhelm. They welcome. Their height is dignified, not towering. Their spacing is wide enough for light to wander through, for people to gather without crowding, for birds to pass between beams without rush. The space inside, though grand, does not echo. It listens. Those who entered in the temple's earliest days noticed this right away. They lowered their voices. They adjusted their steps. The marble floor, though firm, seemed to hush each sound before it could rise. It was said that the gods needed nothing, but if they were to visit the world of men, they deserved stillness. They deserved a structure not of luxury, but of poise. So, the temple offered nothing extravagant. No gilded moldings, no painted frescoes screaming from the walls. Only form, only balance, only geometry, in service of peace. And in this restraint, the Parthenon became powerful. The statue of Athena Chryselephantine, enormous, radiant, would one day be placed within. But even she, for all her scale and splendor, would not overwhelm the space. She would fit, because the temple had already prepared for her, not with excess, but with emptiness, a place ready to receive. That readiness extended to the very edges of the building. Even the roof, those heavy marble tiles, stacked one upon another, rested in place by gravity alone. No pins, no clamps, just precision, just trust. To walk beneath such a roof is to feel safety without confinement. Outside, the lions carved at the corners opened their mouths for water, not words. The friezes whispered stories in shallow relief. The pediments high above, filled now with the gods, did not shout down at mortals. They watched, stilled in their postures, as if paused mid-thought. Nothing in the temple demands belief. It simply offers space. Space to witness, to wonder, to be. And in that offering, the Parthenon teaches something. That divinity does not always reside in grandeur. That faith can be expressed in fit. That to hold the gods, one must hold the earth. Gently, wisely, without force. The wind passes through the columns without complaint. The rain touches the marble and flows away. The sun moves across the stylobate, casting shadows that shift slowly from one side to the other, each hour marked not by bells, but by light. And still, the temple stands, not because it clings, but because it understands how to let go of everything except what is necessary. The gods, if they ever stood beneath its roof, were not bound there. They were welcomed. And even now, the temple waits not to impress them, but to host them without a nail, without a bond. Just stillness, just space, just the quiet strength of a structure that needs nothing more than what it already is. And so it stands, long after the last hammer was silenced, long after the tools were racked and the ramps dismantled, long after the footsteps of the builders faded into wind. The Parthenon remains, not merely as marble and mathematics, not as a monument to power or pride, but as something quieter, a breath held in stone, prayer without words, a temple that does not speak, but listens to the sky, to the city below, to the footsteps that still cross its threshold without fanfare. Its proportions remain soft, deliberate, unforced. Its columns still lean in, not to dominate, but to embrace. Its floors still welcome the light, then give it back. Its roof still waits for rain, for birds, for time. In every groove, every seam, every near, invisible dowel, hidden deep inside, there is patience, there is care, there is the simple miracle of something made to endure, not by power, but by presence. The statue of Athena once stood tall within, shimmering with gold and ivory, but even she is gone now, and still the temple breathes, not as it once did, bustling with processions and offerings, but as a place emptied of all but what matters. Balance, bit, light, dight, silence, space. Perhaps that is the highest form of prayer, not the words offered in haste, but the structure shaped in stillness, the hand that fits the stone with care, the eye that waits for the light to fall just right, the breath that pauses before the final strike, and perhaps you feel it now, that hush beneath the arches, that echo between columns, that warmth in stone touched by centuries. You are not alone in that stillness. You walk where others have walked, and where others will walk after you, moved not by the grandeur of history, but by its gentleness. So let this story rest here, where the stones are settled, where the lines have found their balance, where the builder's hands, though long gone, still guide the air that moves between the pillars. And may the stillness of the Parthenon guide you too into rest. If this gentle journey has carried you into calm, let us know below. Until next time, sweet dreams from Sleepy Chronicles.